What I wanted to do to begin is touch on two or three issues that were, in my view, not covered appropriately last time, and which come in some sense from the first half of the second charter, which we dealt with a month ago. And we, in a sense, we had a very rich discussion, and we ran a bit out of time. And I thought it would be useful to go back and just say a few things about those issues. I noticed that Joseph Baratta is present, and I wanted to take the opportunity to say that the book that he wrote, actually two-volume book, The Politics of World Federation, was a most important input into our own thinking, and it was a very rich source of historical facts and interesting anecdotes. Certainly, speaking for myself, I read both volumes cover to cover, and I just wanted to pay a little bit of tribute to Professor Baratta for the very, very fine work that he did in those two volumes, which was one of the best things I have read in the preparations for the work that we did on the second charter. And actually, on that, I want to quote a couple of things that he mentioned in that particular book. One is a quote attributed to Cord Meyer, who was a member of the U.S. delegation at the San Francisco conference, actually one of the younger members. And he wrote an article in the Atlantic. Thank you, Joseph, for bringing that article to our attention. I actually was able to retrieve this 1946 article from the archives. And in it, there is a quote where Mayer says, "A major power can violate every principle and purpose set forth in the Charter and yet remain a member of the organization by the lawful use of the veto power expressly granted to it." And Cord Meyer was one among many other voices at the time who basically warned that the veto in the Security Council would in many ways undermine the effectiveness of the organization, because it would not allow problems between the major powers or their allies, to be solved in an effective way. And I don't know whether I am the first person that has referred to the veto as the original sin of the United Nations, but I think it is a very appropriate. It's a very appropriate description. In his book, Joseph quotes a German diplomat who essentially was commenting on Article 109 and how Article 109 was essentially introduced to placate many countries that felt tremendously uncomfortable and were very hostile to the veto. And let me just quote from Joseph's quoting George Witschel, a renowned German diplomat, where he said, "It was a major factor in overcoming the resistance of many small and medium-sized states to the Yalta formula, stating the right to veto in San Francisco." Then I do want to say something. I may have made brief reference to this in the first introduction, but I think it is a point worth making. Sometimes I am asked, what have been the sources of inspiration for the second charter project? And speaking for myself, I want to pay tribute, to the work the monumental work that was done in the late 50s by Granville Clark and by Louis Son. Obviously, that was not an even or sort of even partnership. I think Granville Clark was definitely the leading contributor to that project, and you can see this in the introductory 50-page chapter, which is signed by him personally. But this was, a very comprehensive, very monumental effort to review the charter, and it was an inspiration to us because we decided to actually adopt the format of Granville Clark, which is to show the original charter and to show in effectively track changes, the new language and the new proposals that are being put on the table, and we found that very, very useful as a didactic exercise, and we replicated it in the second charter. Okay, so much for the past. In terms of the charter itself, I did want to say a couple of things about two issues that were not touched upon last time. One of them has to do with the Earth System Council. You know that this is an innovation in the second charter. We have created an entire new chapter within the charter, and it was alluded to very briefly last time, but I just want to spend 1 minute literally saying a little bit more. Essentially, the idea here is to give to the United Nations system a certain kind of coherence in the area of climate, which, as you know, was not a priority, to say the least, in the 1945 charter. It is not that we weren't aware of the greenhouse effect back in 1945. That's actually something that comes from the late 19th century. Svante Arrhenius, the Swedish chemist that subsequently won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1907, had already warned us about the relationship between carbon dioxide concentrations and average global temperatures. But essentially, the Earth System Council is supposed to coordinate global environmental policy. It's supposed to harmonize international environmental law. The idea is essentially to have a body that oversees negotiations and implementation of global environmental treaties. It calls for the establishment of a global environmental authority under its direction. This authority becomes the executive organ of the Earth System Council and assumes functions that currently are being carried out by UNEP. And so essentially, in a nutshell, the idea is to consolidate fragmented global environmental architecture, which at the moment is disaggregated. It's a bit of a mess to just finalize this part. And then my second comment has to do, and I regret that Andrew Strauss is not here, and I just want to bring to your attention something that sometimes people do not notice. If you go back to the 1945 charter, you know very well that the statute of the International Court of Justice is an integral part of it. It is, in fact, the charter is published jointly with the statute of the Court of Justice. And you will notice in your copy of the second charter, if you have a hard copy, or your online copy, that the statute of the International Court of Justice does not appear in it. It does not mean that we don't have a revision of the European of the statute of the International Court of Justice. We do have it. It just, we didn't have time to include it in this, but it was subsequently put online on our website, and then it has now been published and included in a document that was published last November called Protocols Complementary to the Second Charter. And so it's there, and it was an arduous work. It involved some top international lawyers, including a professor at Oxford University, Philippa Webb, Andrew Strauss, and others. Here, and Andy didn't have a chance to get into the details, so let me spend 1 minute just giving you the gist of what we have done to the Statute of the International Court of Justice. Obviously, this statute it lays out compulsory jurisdiction for all members to settle disputes. And I think Andy did manage to say that last time, but I want to elaborate a little bit more. The revisions that we have made to the statute include a very interesting concept. I am not a lawyer, but I think I understand very clearly the intuition of this idea, of this proposal, and it is the concept of appellate jurisdiction, right? That involves appellate review over the decisions of other tribunals. Let me give you an example. At the moment, we have, for instance, the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement on the one hand, and we have the World Trade Organization on the other. And a decision may be made by these three countries, and it is possible under the existing system that when they go through the mechanisms that both organizations have, the WTO and the US-Canada-Mexico agreement, that they might get conflicting interpretations of a particular trade conflict that these three countries may have. And the idea of appellate jurisdiction is basically that we are conferring to the Court of Justice the ability to take over and to become like a global court of final appeal, right? So if Canada is in disagreement with the rulings because the rulings are contradictory, they would take it to the International Court of Justice, and then the decisions of the International Court of Justice would be binding and would be final, right? So that is an innovation, and I think it is a very sound innovation, very well grounded of the international law. And then the other perhaps less central but equally interesting power granted to the Court of Justice under our revision is that we give it the ability to exercise binding judicial review over decisions or actions of other UN bodies, right? United Nations is an aggregation of many institutions. It may be possible, let's take an example, this is just coming out of my mind, let's take an example that one of the agencies of the United Nations does something or decides something, which then leads to controversy or to disagreement among member states. Then what we're essentially saying is that the Court of Justice, would examine the decisions taken by some of these UN bodies, and then they would issue a resolution or an opinion that would be binding and final. All right. So I just wanted to touch on that and bring to your attention that if you're a lawyer, there is a copy online of the revised statute of the International Court of Justice. I will stop here and then pass it back to you, James. But I felt it was important to make those points.
Thank you, Augusto. I would like just to ask now if there are any questions on Augusto's opening remarks, or if we can continue to Patricia's comments. Joseph, please.
Well, thank you, Augusto, for those kind remarks. I'm just a kind of lonely scholar, but I dreamed I might have a little influence on more vigorous people, and I'm so pleased that that work of mine came to your attention. I think at Georgetown University, sometime I'd like to ask you about that. I'd like to ask now a question with relation to Article 12 of your new second UN Charter. This is the article that provides for a kind of institutionalized Uniting for Peace resolution.
Joseph, may I recommend, we will come to Article 12 towards the end of the session. Perhaps we could have the question then.
Oh, you're not asking questions now?
No, we are, but we will cover explicitly Chapter 12 towards the end of the session. So perhaps we could refer to the question then in the context, once Veselin and Augusto have had the chance to speak about it.
I'm overruled.
Is that okay, or would you prefer to do it now?
If I'm out of order.
Thank you. So I will then hand over to Patricia Rinaldi. Patricia, could you please take us through Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 on the Economic and Social Council?
Of course. Thank you, James. Hello, everybody. A pleasure to be here with you today. I want to discuss these two chapters that usually are not the most exciting chapters of the UN Charter for most people, but I find them fascinating because I think a very important innovation of the UN Charter is there, especially in chapter 9, because that chapter really states that peace cannot be achieved by itself. It's required to have economical and social stability as a way of achieving peace, and also that peace is an essential part of social and economic prosperity. And that was true back in 45, and that is true today. Most countries from the global south, they consider that they cannot achieve peace without achieving as well economic and social progress. So for our work in the second charter, it was important to highlight these innovative aspects of chapters 9 and 10. So for those chapters, our idea was to expand this, I would say, dialectic relationship between socioeconomic development and peace to all the pillars of the United Nations work. And probably you have discussed this in your previous session. But in this second charter, we imagine the UN based on 4 pillars, in which we also would include sustainable development, human rights, the planetary environment with the Earth Systems Council. So for those chapters, our main focus was to bring all those aspects together and highlighting the multidimensional perspective of peace. So in terms of design, I think the core point of our work in those chapters is to redefine the role of ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. The reform of ECOSOC has been debated since UN's early years. For most people, ECOSOC is very inefficient. There are lots of people that defend exterminating or eliminating ECOSOC. But in our proposal, we see value of having a UN Economic and Social Council, because the United Nations system really needs a deliberative and implementing body that could focus on issues related to economic, social, gender issues, educational issues, healthy issues, and bringing this broader perspective of peace. So for making ECOSOC more efficient, in those 2 chapters, chapter 9 and 10, we addressed the 3 inconsistencies that the original UN Charter presented in relation to ECOSOC. And we present recommendations to address those 3 issues. So the first issue is that the original UN Charter presents overlapping functions between the General Assembly and ECOSOC. And that's actually because of the proper history of ECOSOC and how that body was negotiated. Actually, it was the United States in the Dumbarton Works Conference in 44 that proposed the creation of ECOSOC. But for the United States, the idea was to have ECOSOC as a subsidiary body of the General Assembly. But precisely because of the presence and the diplomatic engagement of small and medium states during the San Francisco Conference in 45, those small and medium states, especially states from Latin America, they defended ECOSOC to be an autonomous body and not a subsidiary body of the General Assembly. So the result in the final UN Charter is that ECOSOC is a proper UN body, but there are different parts of the UN Charter in which the GA and ECOSOC mandates overlap. So for instance, if you compare Article 7 and Article 60 and 66, the GA and ECOSOC, they have pretty much the same powers. And also if you compare Articles 13 with Article 62 in terms of functions, ECOSOC and General Assembly, they pretty much have the same functions as well. So since in the original UN Charter, both organs, they cover the same area of work, there has been no clear division of labor between them, which has led to something that's very common in the UN, which is the duplication of work. So we have seen the agenda items related to social and economic development being duplicated in the GA and ECOSOC. And in the end, ECOSOC has less power than the General Assembly because of its smaller composition. So how we tried to resolve this problem with the 4-pillar 4 councils structure proposed in our second UN Charter. So the idea is to have the General Assembly as the main chief and deliberative policy-making body of the UN, which is actually Article 12 that Professor Barata mentioned. And the GA would be that chief and deliberative body alongside the Parliamentary Assembly, which you have discussed, I think, in the previous session. So under the overall GA and PA guidance, ECOSOC would really focus on 2 areas of implementation, which we believe would be the core value of ECOSOC. If ECOSOC could really be a body to follow up, monitor, and review the progress of its area of work, especially economic and social development and major conferences, and that would also include, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. But another strength of ECOSOC that we highlighted in our second charter is the importance of ECOSOC into being a knowledge sharing and mutual learning body. So ECOSOC would be the analytical leader body of this new UN, since we understand that ECOSOC has a strong mandate in being a sort of knowledge building organ. So that's how we try to solve this first problem of overlapping functions between the GA and ECOSOC would be focused on following up, reviewing UN commitments, and also being this knowledge building organ for the UN. There is another inconsistency in the UN Charter regarding ECOSOC, which is the second issue we try to solve. That is the problem of coordination, especially the coordination of subsidiary bodies of the UN and specialized agencies. As you all know, the UN Charter provides pretty much no governance or a very weak governance framework for the specialized agencies, because the UN Charter was built upon very functionalist ideas, and it's based on decentralization and the specialization of these agencies. So ECOSOC in practice, there's no fundamental role in bringing coherence to the UN system, especially the UN development system. So we all know that one of the major problems of the UN today is overlapping activities, competition of different agencies for agendas, financial resources, lack of communication, and lack of cooperation. And in the end, the UN system duplicates all those efforts at the national level and creates sort of parallel entities that compete each other and they undermine their own effectiveness. So in our second charter, we propose that ECOSOC would be the body focused on strengthening the coordination role of the UN system. ECOSOC would have the power to integrate better the UN system from the UN level to the country level, because the country level is pretty much not addressed in the original UN Charter. And we know most of the work of the United Nations nowadays happens at the country level. That's where the specialized agencies work. So we gave ECOSOC that power to coordinate from the UN level to the local level, and ECOSOC would provide sort of an operational guidance to the specialized agencies and monetary bodies. And I think considering we're now in this moment of the UN80 scheme, I would like just to differentiate our proposal from the UN80 agenda. The UN80 agenda is pretty much a code-casting exercise. So the mergers, all the attempts to reform the UN system under the UN80 proposal, it's only based on shrinking operations for cost-cutting sake. And that's not what we are proposing. What we envision is that ECOSOC would really change the basic structure of UN development operations. So as UN80 only proposes cutting costs, we propose shifting the allocation of power as ECOSOC would have that central role of coordinator. And finally, the third issue we address with ECOSOC is the problem of representation. It's a long debate since the 90s if ECOSOC should have an universal membership, just like the GA, or if ECOSOC should be a smaller country. In the second charter, we did not change the composition of ECOSOC. We kept now the original seats for ECOSOC, but we consider that the most important thing about ECOSOC is that it is a revolving door for civil society engagement and multi-stakeholder engagement with the UN. So instead of discussing if ECOSOC should have universal membership or being smaller, we concentrated in expanding this role of ECOSOC as a revolving door for civil society actors and other stakeholders, especially those that face most difficulty into being part of the UN system because of the ridiculous accreditation system of ECOSOC. So we concluded last year our protocol to expand the inclusion of non-state stakeholders and how they could be better consulted in matters of policy and process at the United Nations. And ECOSOC would also have a greater role in bringing more voices and make the UN more diverse in terms of representation of non-state actors at the UN. So I'll stop here and glad to answer your questions about ECOSOC in chapters 9 and 10. Thank you, James.
Excellent, Patricia. Thank you so much. So I will come to the floor for questions about ECOSOC. Winston, please. Please be so kind as to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Patricia, thank you for bringing to the discussion of the UN the role of ECOSOC. We tend to overlook or seek not to understand the importance of economic issues and discuss the political as if they were separate. You seek to integrate them. But I have a problem with what you are seeking in the pursuit of coherence. And we do need coherence. You're shifting the seat of that coherence from the General Assembly to ECOSOC. That's putting things pretty close to what is frequently called economism, where the economic consideration of matters makes the political a subsidiary. So that's one issue that I'd hope you'd address to me. The second is that your coordination seems quite incomplete. What would be the relationship between ECOSOC and the Bretton Woods system, namely the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund in particular? Earlier in the discussion of the second charter, I had made reference to the veto that the US exercises in those bodies. And let me just mention for our general discussion, the IMF. When it was originally created, important issues could be discussed and changes wrought within the operation of the IMF if one could mount a 70% majority. The US had 31% of the votes, meaning the US alone could veto what could happen there. Then an amendment took place in which important issues could be discussed and decisions made with an 85% majority, except that the US had 16% of the vote this time, meaning it retained the veto. Somehow we don't seem to focus on how destabilizing this work of the veto has been in the role of the issues of development. I hope you will kindly comment on these two areas.
James, are we doing one-on-one, or are we going to have a round of questions and reply them all together?
Please take the time now.
Oh, okay, of course. Thank you, Wisdom, for bringing those two important issues up. Regarding your first question about politics and economic issues, I'm sorry if I didn't express myself clearly, but we don't propose to everything to be centralized in ECOSOC or have an economic view or dominance over other UN issues. In our original proposal for this UN Charter, the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly would be the core organs, deciding all the important matters and giving the general guidelines for the entire UN system. So nothing of ECOSOC could be done without an explicit mandate coming from the GA and the PA altogether, since those two would be the universal bodies of this new UN, representing member states with the GA and representing the peoples with the Parliamentary Assembly. So our 4 pillars for councils structure means that those bodies, those councils, they would draw their mandates from the decisions taken together from the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly, precisely to avoid such technocratic views of those pillars and those areas, which usually happens in small and very technocratic councils. So I understand your point of view, and I totally agree with you that the importance of economic issues and development and related to peace, they should have a very integrated and holistic perspective. So at least from what we are proposing here with the coordination role of ECOSOC, that coordination role would come from a mandate decided by the GA and the PA. So in that sense, ECOSOC would be more sort of an would take the implementation role of the decisions taken by the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly altogether. And regarding Bretton Woods institutions, I totally agree with you that a major issue is that they operate pretty much outside of the provisions and the principles of the UN Charter. Although in this second charter, we have not addressed the Bretton Woods institutions in detail, and particularly we presented the overall proposal for renewing ECOSOC. But, and here I'm speaking by myself, I'm not sure if that's the opinion of other authors of the second charter, and I'm sure that Augusto, being a former member of the World Bank, would probably have some comments on that as well. The fact that specialized agencies, they have lots of autonomy and they can operate pretty much outside the provisions of the UN Charter is also a symptom of one of those issues. So what we were trying to offer with the second charter is also making a criticism of such autonomy of these specialized agencies and how much impact they can have, especially when they have veto power. And I think it's the same problem with the Security Council, with the IMF and the World Bank. So I think overall, our proposal of the second charter also addresses your concerns about this scene of the veto and how negative it is when we're talking about global governance in general and economic and financial global governance in specifics. But Augusto has lots of works on the Bretton Woods institutions reform, and maybe he would like to make additional comments on that as well.
With James' permission, if I can just take a minute. Thank you, Patricia, for your very comprehensive presentation on ECOSOC and the problems that we saw in the 1945 chapter. You know, of course, you know that the creation of the IMF and the World Bank preceded actually the San Francisco conference by a year. By the time the delegates met in San Francisco, the IMF and the World Bank had been established and they had their own governance procedures. These organizations are fairly autonomous. They each have their own articles of agreement. The IMF articles of agreement, which is the equivalent of the charter, has been amended more than 20 times. And they also adopted a governance framework that gives voice to every member. They have a system of weighted voting and so on. So by the time the member states met in San Francisco, I think that they felt that it was not necessary for the UN Charter, to revise or to review, the progress that has been made over the previous years in terms of how the IMF and the World Bank were going to operate with a fair degree of autonomy. Think of the complications, right? The World Bank finances itself in the markets. The IMF is actually like a world central bank. It creates its own currency, the SDR. We did not wish to get into a second UN charter that would address the incredibly complex and technically challenging issues of how to modernize the IMF and the World Bank. Which is not to say that that is not an interesting subject in and of itself. And it is possible that the Global Governance Forum will take up as a separate project the issue of, how could we modernize the IMF? How could we bring the IMF, how could we turn it into a more effective crisis manager? The IMF has had a very mixed history over the last several decades, some successes and a lot of failures. So the organization is very much in need of modernization and reform, but we did not wish to have that conversation in the context of the second charter. Just a little footnote, Winston, if I may. There is no formal veto in the IMF and the World Bank. What does happen is for those decisions that require 85% majority, because the United States has a 17% voting power, it has in practice a veto. But it is seldom exercised, and many of the decisions don't require an 85% majority. And therefore, at least my experience, sitting at times on the boards of both organizations for meetings and so on, I just want to highlight that a vote is hardly ever taken. It is a very infrequent occurrence when the member states who are sitting around the table in 25 constituencies decide to take a vote on a particular issue. By and large, it is very collegial, it is consultative, and it has worked in practice in a wonderful way, actually. So I just wanted to highlight that little sort of fact for everybody. Thank you.
Just slightly rebut Augusto's. I am awake to the issue of consensus, as it is used frequently. When states do not want to behave in a manner that suggests that they overtly veto matters. The US doesn't have to exercise its veto in the Security Council. If indeed within the debate it takes a certain stance, you don't want to go very much further and test that veto. You try to find an accommodation that will not invite the veto. That's part of what has been happening in the IMF and the World Bank. That's precisely how power, and the powerful generally, goes about operating, because it preserves the patina of legitimacy. So I understand what you've just said, but I know how these matters operate.
Thank you, Winston. Augusto, would you like to respond? Or you would like to continue?
Thank you, Winston. I would love to get together for coffee with you at some point, and we could have a 2-hour discussion because you obviously are very well informed and familiar with these issues. One thing that you did not mention, which I do want to say, is that the Americans at the World Bank and the Europeans at the IMF have claimed the top job, since the founding of the organization. And I just wanted to highlight that this is regarded by other member countries essentially as an abuse of authority, because the aim is not to elect the person that is most qualified for that particular job, but it is rather to look within either Europe in the case of the IMF, the US in the case of the World Bank, that person which coming from that region will be best qualified to run these organizations. And I just want to mention that most member countries are tired of this practice and very much against it, which is one of the reforms that we would advocate if the Global Governance Forum were to be engaged in a project looking at IMF reform, for instance. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you, Augusto. Thank you, Patricia, for your presentation and your responses. Winston, thank you for your questions. It's now my pleasure to move on to Yvette. Yvette will take us through highlights of Chapter 11 on the Human Rights Council. Yvette, it's over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. The UN Charter, adopted in San Francisco, contains several provisions on human rights that were critically important, but it did not include an architecture for human rights in the Charter itself. Now, it was in 1946, the Economic and Social Council actually set up one of the two functional commissions they set up in 1948. One was the Commission on Human Rights, and the commission existed from 1946 to 2006. One of the highlights, what it came out with, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So basically, what we sought to do, first of all, in developing a second charter, the first thing was to include a human rights architecture in the charter, because we all know that the charter is treated as the sort of Bible of the United Nations, and everything refers to that charter. And if human rights is not in that charter, specifically on the Human Rights Council, it is disadvantaged. So one of the things we did was to have a chapter on the Human Rights and the Human Rights Commission. It was particularly easy to have that chapter because Resolution 6251 of the General Assembly, which set up the Human Rights Council, had all the provisions that we felt were important to be included in the chapter to give it the legitimacy that the other parts of the UN system has. So that was a bit easier, and we were particularly happy with some of the work which the Human Rights Council has done, including particularly the Universal Periodic Review. And this was a difference from the Human Rights Commission, which it succeeded, because selections were made and it was thought to be biased. But for the new Human Rights Council, is that every single country in the world is subject to the Universal Periodic Review, in which all the human rights activities in that particular country is reviewed, is peer reviewed, and recommendations are made. If you look at the recommendations emerging from the Human Rights Council, they tell you, they give you a picture of the human rights situation in a particular country, because the recommendations are made, they use some of the recommendations that have come from the treaty bodies, the human rights treaty bodies, as well, and these come out in the Human Rights Council, and countries are supposed to follow up on the recommendations. Of course, we noted that the implementation of these recommendations have not been what it should be, but again, there are mechanisms now being developed within the Human Rights Council to look into that particularly, and to see how countries can be assisted to implement the recommendations that come out of the Universal Periodic Review. It's interesting to note that many of the recommendations, the Universal Periodic Review for each country happens in 3 to 4 years. And people note that some of the recommendations are carried over, but sometimes it's not because the country doesn't want to implement it, but because it lacks the capacity or the means to implement it, and that needs to be given closer attention. So basically, the first thing that we concern ourselves with is to include human rights architecture in the second UN Charter. And then the second thing came where we looked at is the inclusion of this Human Rights Council as a principal organ. Because if you look at the 4 pillars that the second charter is addressed, you'll see that human rights is one such pillar. We have, of course, peace and security represented by the Security Council. We have development, economic and social development by ECOSOC, and we have, and then human rights represented by the Human Rights Council, and also the Earth Systems Council. So these are the 4 pillars, and we want to say that, make a point that human rights is not the 3rd or the 4th pillar of the United, it's one of the pillars and is entitled to have equal status with the other parts of the UN. Now, but one thing that was very important when we were in our deliberations was we were very concerned, and I think this has been mentioned before, is the silos at which the different UN organs operate. Now, the silos means that ECOSOC has nothing, does not have any formal arrangement with the formal arrangements, links, no formal links with the Security Council, no formal links with the Human Rights Council, has no formal link established through the charter with any of the other bodies. Of course, it wasn't there, but we see that there are silos. But one thing that we looked at, because if we agree that the United Nations was set up to prevent conflicts, then the system that we have does not pay enough attention to prevention. And we believe that in order to be able to address prevention, these bodies need to work together. And so in what we came out with, there are 2 parts of this that we came out with. If you look at one article that we had, which is under the Human Rights Council, where it was stated specifically that that the Human Rights Council shall furnish information about persistent human rights violations, including early warning information to the Security Council and the Economic and Social Council, with a view to soliciting early actions to prevent situations from developing into conflicts, and shall assist the Security Council and the Economic and Social Council upon their request. This is because we see, because not much attention is paid on prevention, we see that the whole mechanisms of the UN system only acts when things have gone out of control. The first time something comes to the Security Council, for instance, is when the genie is out of the bottle, so to speak. But if you look at human rights, you can see that persistent and systematic violation of human rights are situations which lead to conflict. And what the Human Rights Council does is to monitor the situation in various countries. But without that link with the Security Council, they come out with reports, they make recommendations, but nothing happens. They cannot even send a report directly to the Security Council unless they send it to the Secretary General, and the Secretary General decides whether or not that report should be available to the Security Council. So we did put one or 2. And the other thing that we put there also under the Pacifics in chapter 6, under Pacific Settlement of Disputes, we had a clause there which says the Security Council shall hold regular, joint sessions with the Economic and Social Council, the Human Rights Council, and the Earth System Council in order to address the prevention of conflicts and sustaining peace. I mean, we felt very strongly of this lack of links between the various organs. And these two clauses which we have in the second charter, we believe would make things better, would at least make it provide some means of some formal link between the various organs of the United Nations. And this could make, when it's done correctly, this could be very important in prevention, in the whole prevention, which is after all what the UN is all about. Now, okay, so basically, also by giving the Human Rights Council, making it a principal organ, it would give it more power, or if you like, or more weight in order to be able to enforce some of what is contained in the human rights, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is important because countries should not look at human rights activities as a feel-good thing to do, but it has to be the case has to be made that it is a very important part of the work of the United Nations, and it is important if peace and security is to be maintained. So that is what I would say for now. I would wait to see if there's any questions or anything to elaborate on further.
Thank you, Yvette. Wonderful discussion there. So I would call on any questions. I see Winston with your hand up. So I'll come to Winston first. Please unmute yourself, Winston. Winston, I can see you speaking, but we can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
It's unmute.
Commending Yvette on her presentation, and I agree with her about the importance of human rights, and I think it is the most important area of focus of the United Nations, including the elimination of war. But would you consider as a possibility or something that merits further consideration on the part of the Second Charter, that we have an appellate court, a human rights court, that would have the same standing of the International Court of Justice, and it would correspond largely with what is happening in Western Europe. Europe has its Court of Justice in the European Union, as well as its Court of Human Rights. Latin America has the same thing. Africa has moved into that direction in its Charter on Human and People's Rights. It's created a separate judiciary. So could you comment on that?
Yeah. Okay. I think when we I mean, for instance, the International Court of Justice, we believe could serve in the purpose that you're talking about. And probably no need, I don't know if Augusto wants to comment on that, but I believe that, yes, it is true that countries get away with not implementing or with violations of human rights. And there needs to be, and that's an interesting suggestion that you come up with. It is true that within Europe, within Africa even, there's a court of on human rights, but not within the UN system. So I think that it makes a lot of sense to have that. But for my own part, I saw this as falling within the ambits of the International Court of Justice. And maybe Augusto could comment on that.
Would you like to respond, Augusto?
Oh,
you're looking to unmute. I see.
Yeah, I wasn't clear whether you were giving the floor to Gail. I think that Yvette's point that the International Court of Justice, who in our scenario becomes the final court of appeal is a good one. Having said that, one cannot deny that under existing systems, we do have these regional courts, and they have played a role, from time to time. And we don't think that this is inconsistent with the proposals that we have put on the table for the International Court of Justice. I think that regional bodies are legitimate. I think that they can be created. The European Union is a very good example. Winston has given that as an example himself. What we are saying is that in the case of the European Court of Justice, that they would have the final word on these kinds of matters. Let's suppose that the European Court of Justice issues a decision, that is not accepted by the parties in question. In our system, they would have the ability to appeal to the International Court of Justice for a review of the decision of the European Court of Justice, and that decision would be binding and would be final. Okay, so the two organs can coexist for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Augusto. I will now hand over to Gail. Gail, please ask your question.
For all of these organizations, the question I have is implementation. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said recently that there is no rules-based order. We have the rules, supposedly, but he said we pretended like they were actually rules that were implemented because he and Canada benefited from them at the time. But then when Trump started talking about Greenland and Canada, he realized, hey, these could be used against me. Maybe, because he said, in essence, the problem is when you have, it could look beautiful, all these rules. But if they're not implemented in an egalitarian fashion, they become actually weapons that the powerful use against the relatively powerless. So a country that isn't very powerful, if it does something to violate any of the rules, they get slammed. But right now, we see this, where Russia, the US, Israel, these powerful countries are just going rampant, and nobody's calling them to account in the slightest. So I'm thinking that needs to be a whole other area of examination of how do we implement, how do we get countries to adhere to whatever it is, whatever beautiful things we come up with.
Yeah.
Gail, you're absolutely right. It is. It goes back to the original sin of the UN, correct? That you have 188 countries which are expected to abide by the principles of the Charter, and they have a whole range of obligations. And then you have 5 countries who, through the veto, can essentially exempt themselves from those obligations and can remain, members in good standing of the United Nations, right? So we have the foreign minister of Russia crossing the threshold of UN headquarters, even though his country is violating most of the important principles in the area of peace and security of the UN Charter. And he can even become chairman of the Security Council during the sessions and the rotating chairmanship of the Security Council, right? More and more countries are basically objecting to this, right? So I think that what we're trying to do is come up with a system where that kind of abuse of state power, will be curtailed. And that we discussed last time, for instance, the veto override that we have introduced in our proposals for amending and reforming the Security Council.
If I may, I would add that I think we can imagine what an international court of justice might look like without a veto by looking at the European Court of Justice, where none of the countries have a veto. And that is the EU is a club in which your voting rights and ultimately your ability to draw on European funds can be suspended. And those have happened in certain cases when countries move outside of the lines of the agreed treaties within the countries of the EU and its regulations and rules. So we can imagine a situation in which the veto does not exist. There is a working example of it. Perhaps it doesn't adjudicate quite to the same degree that an International Court of Justice would have to, but it's nonetheless an interesting case. Bob, please can you unmute?
Okay, my cursor was hidden. It took a second. So yeah, I have actually a parallel question to what Gail just asked, which is kind of a strategy question. That given the fact that many national leaders are now turning their backs on international law, and we have two major wars going, we have growing tension with China, and many other situations around the world, strategically, I'm thinking we're facing headwinds now for our ideas as a movement that are possibly greater than during the Cold War. So it's great that the proposals exist, but how do you get the proposals accepted? The strategy from getting from the good ideas that we have and in many cases have had for decades, how do we get them accepted and implemented? Once they're implemented, great, but how do we get to the goal, to that goal? So I'm happy to hear thoughts of any of the panelists on that.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, that's a broad question. So I would open that up to any of the authors, Augusto, Patricia, Yvette, and good day, Veselin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. One of the mechanisms that we're using, to address this question is basically by calling for a review conference under Article 109, right? In other words, we understand that the world is under huge pressure. We understand that there are a whole range of risks which threaten our future. Gail, and I assume you agree with Gail, has mentioned the abuse of power, the willingness of the major powers to essentially violate international law and ignore their commitments under the 1945 charter and so on. So that's absolutely clear. But then what we're doing is we're basically saying, because of these things, because of this very complex geopolitical situation, what we need to do is we need to trigger Article 109 and have a conversation as to how we could modernize our global governance architecture and bring the UN system into the 21st century in a way that provides incentives for countries to abide by the commitments that they can make under a new charter, right? And so I want to highlight something because you all of you have been studious. You have read the document. You have given 3 hours by the time we finish this session to deliberation around it. I just want to highlight that this is not just an academic exercise. I mean, it's academic in the sense that we think that the second charter is fairly coherent. We have given a great deal of thought, to coming with proposals which are sensible and that try to strike a middle ground between, being completely utopian on the one hand and being tinkering at the edges on the other, and coming forward with proposals that don't really change the system in any fundamental way. Whether we got that balance right, we will learn over time. But we want to go beyond having a document that gathers dust in our bookshelves. No, we are actively engaged in member states. Between September and November, when I was in New York on 2 occasions, I have met with 25 missions, sometimes very often at the level of the ambassadors. And I am very encouraged by the fact that many of these member countries are actually rather pleased that a civil society organization has come up with a document that lays out some of the most important issues and that provides an excuse for having a meaningful conversation around how do we narrow the gap between the law on the one hand and actual practice on the other, right? And Gail, that's the spirit of Gail's question. And Bob, I think you are raising an issue from a different angle that addresses the same question. And as you know, I think we said it during the first session, there is a separate sister organization based in Geneva called the Article 109 Coalition, which is essentially working on that kind of political side of this project. The Global Governance Forum remains very much focused on the conceptual development, such as the second charter, and Patricia referred to protocols which we have developed. One, for instance, we published in November on how to create a better way to finance the UN system, because at the moment the system that we have in place is broken down. And then the Article 109 Coalition is going to work, and we are supporting their work in persuading member states, to trigger Article 109 so that we can have that very fundamental conversation in the context of a review conference.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I should say that the situation in the world as we know it now is really unprecedented, if I would say that, put it that way. And the lack of turning the countries' leaders, turning their backs on international law, this is, I believe that these are some of the things which make it important to review the UN Charter. Because, and I think what is happening in the world now has made many countries that before would, if you had told them about a review of the UN Charter, they would have said, no, it's okay as it is. But what is happening now is opening the eyes of many countries to say, yes, indeed, we need it. What we have now is not working. So I think in a sense, what is happening now has led many countries to accept now that there is a need for a review of the UN Charter. And this, I think, is something which one has to note.
Thank you, Yvette. It would be remiss of me at this point not to highlight that our next edition, or our summer edition of the Mondial Journal, which CGS publishes annually, will be entirely focused on Article 109, and the editor-in-chief will be Justin Hanna, who is a member of the CGS board and part of the Secretariat of the 109 campaign. So more news there when it comes. Veselin, please.
Yes, very much in the line of what Augusto and Yvette just said. Yes, we often hear those voices of pessimism and skepticism that it's not the good time, the world is divided, nobody follows the rules. But on another hand, we can make the opposite argument. If the world is perfect and everything is beautiful and cheerful, also nobody will ask, why do we need to change? Everything is beautiful and cheerful. So often in times of crisis is the best time to trigger the idea for review of the organization. And we see those voices all over the world. Just last week in India, the Finnish president, who was the co-chair of the Resina dialogue with Prime Minister Modi, made effectively Article 109 proposal and asking India, New Delhi to be, he was talking about New Delhi moment, not San Francisco moment, but New Delhi moment. So the Global South initiates the new San Francisco moment for change. Also, the other counter argument we often hear when we promote the idea is that we need a third world war. We need a big catastrophe in order to change the organization. Again, it's not a strong argument, let's put it this way. Of course, the UN Charter came after the Second World War, and the League of Nations came after the First World War. But we can argue that if we sum up the situation today with the wars in Ukraine, Sudan, Iran, and many other, Yemen, and many parts of the world, somehow, if we took everything together, if we assemble all this, it's kind of a mini world war already. And on another hand, I will ask, do we need another big disaster? Don't we have already very many big disasters as to expect yet another big disaster as to finally come with the idea for a review conference? And finally, another kind of, I'll say, mistake people make when they approach this is saying that ultimately it should be for the P5 to agree to abandon their veto and their powers. Well, if we wait for that, it will never happen. The P5 will never abandon their veto. So we shouldn't start by asking the question, will China or Russia or United States agree on the change? Don't ask that question. In other words, there are options where the General Assembly convenes a conference in the spirit rather than in the letter of Article 109, and I will explain why. Because if we follow strictly the legal basis of Article 109, it suggests that the P5 should ratify the amendments. However, if we imagine a different scenario, the review conference starts with the Article 109, going back to 1945, reminding the broken promise to have a review conference by year 1955. So this is the beginning of the review conference. But during the review conference, a new charter is drafted and accepted, which has his own ratification mechanism without the necessity to ratify by all the P5. So the conference starts as Article 109, but finishes as a new charter with its own ratification mechanism, no longer going back to 1945 text. So I guess that will be the way where the majority of the member states, so if 2/3 of the member states go that way, the P5 cannot do anything. They will face the majority of the world accepting a new charter and ratifying a new charter without a veto, and they will have very little to do apart from the choice to join or to stay outside. Both ways, there won't be a veto. They may decide to stay outside for some time. And by the way, in 1945, not all big powers were members of the UN. Remember, Germany, Japan, Austria, Italy, many other countries were not original members of the UN. So the next UN might also have no China and Russia for some time until they finally found themselves in isolation. They have no choice but to create a small UN with 10 of their protégés, but that won't work either, because you imagine you have 160 countries in the new UN with some small coalition around China and Russia outside the UN. Fine for some time, but obviously it will be China first to think about, are we a global leader or what? Why do we have an organization of 20 and not an organization of 150 countries? A future Chinese president will definitely prefer to be the leader of the big rather than the small international organization. And same in Russia and United States under new leadership in Moscow and new leadership in Washington. Imagine in 5 to 10 years, it could be also another dynamic. So there are options, and we need to keep talking about those options rather than to remain always skeptical, having the P5 in disagreement to change the charter. The problem, I see it more in the rest of the membership. We need a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly first and foremost. So the problem is not only P5. We would like to see, through all the efforts of the Coalition 119, talking to ambassadors and to governments, to have that body of 130 members in agreement to start a review conference. And then that will be easier. Then we have already a prepared draft of the second charter. There could be also other ideas developed. And we are not stick to what we propose. Again, member states are those to finally agree on a new text. But the veto should not be seen as a problem to review conference and to the adoption of the new charter. Thank you.
If I could just add a footnote to Vesselin's very, very good comments. And that is to imagine a scenario, right? Let's say 2030, 2031, that builds on what just Vesselin has said. On present trends, by 2030 and 2031, we will be in the middle of an incredible set of interacting crises, right? Climate change will continue on the current path, which is destructive and destabilizing. We are going to have a very unsettled security situation for sure, because of growing tensions between the superpowers. So the scenario that Vesselin has just outlined, of a large number of countries coming out of the review conference and actually taking a very strong view that we need to modernize the system, is going to have considerable credibility amidst the global crisis that we're going to be facing. And what will the P5 say at that moment? Oh, we don't like the proposals that are embedded in something like a second charter. To which the member countries will ask, well, what is your proposal? What does Mr. Vladimir Putin put on the table as a way to addressing the crisis that we are facing today? And I am sorry to say that neither the United States, Russia, or China at that moment will have anything to put on the table that will carry the day and that will persuade the other member countries that continuing with the current system, where the P5 have the final say, is the way to go. It just will not be acceptable, I assure you. When we talk to member states, there is an enormous degree of concern, if not to say alarm, about the way we are headed. So I just wanted to say that, because I think that I don't want you to think that the scenario put on the table by Vesselin is unrealistic. I think it's completely realistic the way we're headed.
Thank you, Augusto. Vesselin, thank you tremendously. Jay, I will come to you in just 1 second to close us. We had planned to continue to have a fourth round of discussion about chapters 12 to 14, but we're actually coming up to time, and I think we've had a very vibrant discussion overall in this last 10 minutes. So perhaps we might close without coming to this second round of comments on chapters 12 to 14. Augusto, what do you think?
I would like to go back to Joseph, who had a question on Article 12, I believe, and I would not wish for that.
Us to finish. In that case, what I will do is I'll go to Jay, and then we will come to Joseph to close us. Jay, please.
So I had just 2 questions. I wanted to find out if this is the sole effort worldwide to reform the UN Charter, or if this is one of many efforts, or one of a couple of efforts. When I talk to other people who are interested in world peace, I would like to be able to let them know, kind of where this stands, if you kind of step back from this particular proposal. So the second question I have is simply, where could I write if I wanted to add some thoughts of my own?
Very, very quickly. Of course, there are a number of initiatives that have been put on the table for UN reform over the decades. And we, in putting together the second charter, very respectfully have looked at many of those proposals, going back to Kofi Annan and other secretary generals, and in a way, this project builds on the proposals and important contributions made by literally dozens and dozens of other people. Even before Granville Clark and Louis Son, we had towering figures like Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, others, making concrete proposals. On Security Council reform in particular, there have been many proposals put on the table over the years, and we have become ourselves familiar with those proposals. And in a way, what we have on Chapter 5 on Security Council reform builds on those proposals, right? And then if you want to engage with us in a dialogue, you can write to us at the Global Governance Forum, and we'll be happy to discuss this with you. There is an email address on the website that you can tap into and begin a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jay.
Maybe
Thank
I
you,
should
Augusto.
also add that a lot of the discussions on reform have focused on the Security Council. And what we have done is to look at everything, because not just the Security Council, because to many people, when you say reform of the Charter, they immediately think of the security and nothing else. But what we are trying to say, there are many other things, because the world has changed since 1945.
Thank you, Yvette. With that, Joseph, if you would like to bring us back round to the beginning, you had a question about Article 12. I can invite you now to speak.
Thank you, but I don't wish to raise that question anymore.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Are there any more questions or comments? Winston.
The risk of being labeled one who speaks too much. I really agree with Vaslin's position and the elaboration by Augusto that the focus ought not to be on the permanent five. It is what others can do and set an example for the permanent five. Remember, when all of the sins of the veto were speculated on in 1945, there were things people imagined. Now we don't have to imagine them. We know what has happened. They have no moral ground on which to stand, unless we fundamentally alter what exists. That's my comment.
Thank you, Winston. So I will note that Patricia has kindly put the email address to reach out to Global Governance Forum in the chat. Jay, you can find it there. If anybody else would like to get in touch, you can do so. We've passed time. So unless we have any more questions or comments, I would like to say a tremendous thank you to Augusto, Yvette, Patricia, and Veselin. Veselin particularly, it's very late at night currently in India. So thank you for coming. It has been a tremendously informative pair of sessions. I hope that we will be able to see you again in this or another forum to learn more about how progress is made. I would like to ask the members to stay on for a few moments, but Augusto, Yvette, Patricia, and Veselin, if you need to go, please feel free to do so. Augusto.
Thank you for hosting us. It was a very stimulating set of conversations, and we wish you well. And we hope to continue to be engaged with you in other ways. Thank you.
I might add that I have been in discussions with your colleague Shady, who informed us that you are exploring advocacy and awareness raising with local elected officials about the second UN Charter. And positively, this is something we're also looking to create mechanisms for within CGS, collaboration between our youth programming and our membership to support initiatives like this. So hopefully there will be opportunities not too far down the road where we can substantively support your efforts.